Right, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So hi everyone, my name is Venus Mamek. I'm the Coordinator of Community Relations and Resources at Cystic Fibrosis Canada. On behalf of our Adult Cystic Fibrosis Advisory Committee, I would like to welcome you all to the 6th webinar in our educational series on fertility and family planning for people with cystic fibrosis. Just a bit about the committee. So Cystic Fibrosis Canada's Adult Cystic Fibrosis Advisory Committee provides perspective and advice on CF-related issues and advocates for public policies and programs to help people with cystic fibrosis. Members also foster and support an engaged and knowledgeable CF community. Among the committee's various initiatives, we are pleased to host this webinar series to which different aspects of fertility and family planning are being discussed by a variety of expert guest speakers, as well as people living with CF that are willing to share their personal experiences. Please note, this is an educational webinar series. CF Canada or members of the committee cannot provide any medical advice. Although the series does feature a few CF clinicians and other health professionals, we highly recommend that all persons with CF seek guidance from their CF clinic care team regarding their personal family planning process. Today, we will hear from Dawn Warkentin, Executive Director at Adoption Options, who is very knowledgeable in this field, and then we will hear from 2 adults with CF, Jeremy and Courtney, who will both get a chance to share their experience with the adoption process. And then afterwards, we will open it up for questions. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box. You'll see in the corner panel, and you can submit your questions that way as we go. So to introduce Dawn Warkentin, we are honored to be joined today by Dawn Warkentin to speak on our 6th topic of the series, the adoption process. Dawn was born and raised in northern Indiana, and after graduating from university, she wanted to spend a year in volunteer work. She was excited to see an option to work at an adoption agency and came to Winnipeg in 1998 to work at Adoption Options as a volunteer. Dawn volunteered for 2 years as an adoption counselor and was hired full-time after that. She is a registered social worker and has been at Adoption Options for 21 years. First as an adoption counselor, then as the Intercountry Adoption Coordinator, and now as the Executive Director. Dawn just started in the position in September 2019, and her hope is to create more awareness of adoption as a beautiful option for birth families, adoptive families, and the children that we all love. So Dawn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I'm glad we already have this safe social distancing format set up. So just noting that if I do need to cough or I feel a tickle in my throat, I might have to take a drink of water, but we'll go through. And so I am going to be talking to you about adoption today. And I mean, I am based in Manitoba, so that will kind of be my slant, but there's definitely a lot about how we approach adoptions is how the rest of Canada does. And we are not affiliated with the adoption options in Alberta, but we have a very, very similar process. So just across the different provinces, we will likely use the same type of processes. So we have been around since 1989, and we've helped to create more than 500 families. We're a not-for-profit licensed agency, and we're also a charity. So we provide full adoption services to both birth parents and birth families and prospective adoptive parents. And we are a licensed adoption agency in Manitoba. There are a lot of different reasons that people come to us to look at adopting, and 4 of the main reasons are just couples who are experiencing fertility issues and may have gone through many different rounds of fertility treatments prior to coming to us, or have possibly unexplained fertility issues. There are also families who are experiencing risky or impossible. And so those are definitely serious situations, and families have decided to look at other options as a way to form their family. We also have same-sex couples who are looking at adoption, as well as single individuals as a way of bringing children into their family. And here in Manitoba, we have different types of adoptions, and these are the types of adoptions that would be across Canada as well. So I was just going to quickly go through those just so you kind of know what kind of options you have. The private adoption is the one I'm going to focus on today because that's the one that that's what we facilitate mostly. But the adoption of permanent wards is also an option. The Child and Family Services Agency in each province would have children who are in the care, control, and custody permanently of Child and Family Services. And those children, if they are adoptable, then that agency would look at ways to match families and find these children a permanent home. So that is one way, is to go through the government agency. Private adoption is where the birth parent chooses and meets the prospective adoptive family. The birth mother usually would have some criteria that she would give, and then would be able to choose a family and meet and have ongoing contact. Private adoptions are generally, the majority are open adoptions, which I'll talk about a little bit later. There's also intercountry adoption, which is any adoptions of children from other countries coming to Canada. And so as for adoption options, we have a number of different countries that we work with, and so just different options there. I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding that as well, but like I said, I was going to focus a little bit more on the private adoption aspect. So there's also de facto adoptions, which means if you have legal guardianship of a child and they've been in your care, control, and custody for at least 2 years, and that's Manitoba. It might be different across the provinces, but I think it probably would be fairly similar, that you can apply to adopt that child. Also, there's extended family adoption, which is also common for a birth mother to place her child with somebody within her family to raise. And then there's also adoption by a parent who is married to a child's parent. So simplifying that, that would be a step-parent may adopt the child of their spouse. And definitely, well, in Manitoba, that actually just needs to be done through a lawyer. All other types of adoptions do have to have an agency involved. So a little bit about private adoption. So this is, it's a matching process with birth parents and adoptive families. I did explain a little bit that birth parents choose the family they want to place with. We work with both adoptive families and birth families throughout the process, and private adoptions are open. So there's full disclosure of identities, which means that, you know, adoptive parents and birth parents know addresses, they know how to contact each other. There's varying degrees of openness, but there's definitely knowledge of who everyone is at the very least. So one of the other things that I like to talk about whenever I talk about adoption is just the language we use, because this is something that definitely affects the children that we're all raising. And we want to try and look at some positive ways to frame some terms, and these are some of the highlighted ones that I wanted to talk about, is that we also talk about not labeling, and so that would mean that we want to talk about adoption as a verb, and that's how the child joined the family. So the child was adopted, not is adopted. Rather than labeling them, we can talk about how they joined the family, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing about them. It's a very important part about them, but it's how they entered the family. And we also we use the term birth parents, and sometimes I will just mention birth mothers, but I do mean all birth parents and families. It's just easier to say birth mothers rather than all of them together. But some people might refer to real parents or natural parents when they're referring to birth parents, and we just want to try and get away from that a little bit, because it kind of insinuates that adoptive parents aren't real parents, and we for sure know that adoptive parents are real parents. And so we just want to just be mindful of that as well. And one more thing is that in our society, a lot of people use the term given up for adoption. And I've worked with a lot of birth parents, and that term does not kind of cover what all they go through. Adoption is a very loving decision, and it's given up kind of seems to be a negative way to say it, that they didn't really care, they don't love the child, they are giving up their responsibility, but definitely this process is so difficult for birth parents, and it is not something that they do lightly. It's a very loving decision. So we talk about being placed for adoption as the process of what birth parents go through. So the openness, what is openness and adoption? In Manitoba, our legislation changed in 2015 to open closed records so that adoptees would be able to get information about themselves and otherwise closed adoptions, medical information, some information about their birth family. And so goes to show that, you know, adoptions now are just becoming more open. For sure, any private adoptions in Manitoba have to be open. There are still some closed adoptions, which means that no identifying information is exchanged. Those are usually reserved for situations where there would be a safety issue to the child or to the family if there was direct contact. So that would be very limited, and most birth parents looking at adoption are going to want to look at having some type of openness. And that degree can range from just receiving pictures and updates to ongoing visits or text or phone calls or emails, any type of contact. It's something that is agreed upon between both parties and is something that we do sign a contract for adoptive families and birth families on the type of contact that they are going to continue with. And this is until the child is 18. And it sounds like a big thing to do, but it's most of the time people are on the same page about it, and we come to an understanding together on what everyone is comfortable with. The benefits of open adoption range. There are benefits to all members of the triad, so for birth parents, adoptive parents, and children. So definitely birth parents are wanting to look at open adoption because it gives them that sense of comfort knowing about how the child is doing. Like I mentioned before, adoption is a decision of love. Birth parents love their children, and to have to go through life not knowing how they're doing would be very stressful and unnerving for most birth parents. And that's how it used to be in closed adoptions, and we find that that's not necessarily the best way, if at all possible. To have openness gives birth parents back that feeling of control where they can choose the family. They're making a responsible plan for their child. They're giving their child a family that they aren't able to give them at this point in their life. It's a sense of empowerment, and in moving forward in their lives, I think that helps them to continue to use that to make choices in their life. So that's definitely some benefits for birth families. For adoptive parents, being able to have contact with the birth parents and it provides them a means to get medical information for the child, or just interesting information that the child might want to have about their birth parents. In closed adoptions, children are curious, and they want to know where they came from. And as a parent, to be able to provide that information feels very good to be able to have that, so your child's not wondering and worried about that. It also, just to have that medical information to be able to provide to doctors and nurses that are caring for your child is definitely a very positive thing. Just having that, knowing the birth parents also, takes away that feeling of the unknown. You don't have to wonder if they're going to pop into your lives sometime because they're always there, and always there in a way that is positive. For children, all children are going to wonder who they are, where they came from, and if they don't have the information, a lot of times they come up with some fantasy idea of who their birth parents might be, and this gives them the real information of who they are and where they came from, and they don't need to search for their birth families. They don't have to make the decision if they should or shouldn't do that. They just have that access. And it also helps them to communicate with them, and it helps them to know that their birth parent does love them and they weren't abandoned, and understand the reasons for why they placed them for adoption, because that is certainly important for a child to be able to know. And in our process, when we work with birth parents, we go through a process with them individually, and we also go through a process with adoptive parents individually. And like I said, a lot of these things are similar between the provinces as well. Our process, birth parents are looking at options. They're usually pregnant when they're looking at options. So a lot of our adoptions would be of newborns. And every now and then we will have a child who's older that is placed for adoption. But generally I would say they are newborn adoptions. And so a birth mother will come to an initial meeting, and we would give her all the information. We try and provide as much of an comforting atmosphere as possible so that she does not feel pressured in any way for any type of decision. We do ongoing counseling. We do a lot of decision making, because it's important that even if somebody is planning on placing for adoption, that they have considered parenting and that they've looked at all of their options so that they know they're making the choice that's right for them and their child. Because no matter what, once a child is born, we know that mom is going to be considering parenting at some point. So if she's had the ability to be able to think through that beforehand and know the realities, then she can make more of an informed decision. So we are definitely based on education in that respect. We also help them fill out a medical social history, because, like I said, the medical information is so important for the child to be able to have. And then that way the child can have that information from the start, and hopefully if there is ongoing contact, that medical information will continue to come throughout the child's life. Another part of our process with birth parents is grief counseling, and walking them through the grieving process, the loss of the role of mom, just the loss of having a child in their lives daily. Even though it's open adoption and ongoing contact, they're not a co-parent, and that's something that they understand fully, but it's also a huge loss to birth parents. So we need to kind of prepare them for those different types of losses and different times when they may be feeling different things. And so we support them in any way we can throughout that process. And then another part of our process is to work with them in looking at what kind of family they want for their child and what kind of home do they want for their child. So some different matching criteria are just, whether the family lives in a city or in a rural area, if they have a certain type of religion or not, if they have children, or if they want this to be the first child in the family, if they are wanting to place with a family who has fertility issues or medically or preventing pregnancy because of medical reasons. So there are different types of things that birth parents might be looking for, and every birth parent that comes in wanting one thing, another birth parent comes in wanting another thing. So it's all over the board, and it just depends on what birth parents come in looking for. But these are the types of things we talk with them about and try and find out exactly what kind of family they're interested in. And then once we do have their information of what they're looking for, they are able to, we do a matching process, which I'll explain a little bit later. But then once they're able to review files, they look at a letter that the family has written and some pictures that gives a really good idea of who the family is, and they're able to use that to make their choice in the family. And a birth mother, the next step in the process for her would be to meet the family. And we only have the birth mom meet one family. We ever choose one. And I think our matching process works well in that she's able to get a really good idea of who the family is. And so meeting them is just a confirmation of that. So I'll talk about that process in a minute. I'm going to switch over just to the prospective adoptive parents process and get us to that point as well. So when adoptive parents are looking at adoption, like I said, they come to us for different reasons, and for many, this is not their first attempt at bringing children to their home. So we know that people are coming to us facing possibly many losses already, and so we do acknowledge that and hopefully are sensitive to that throughout the whole process. We have an initial meeting. Well, first of all, we actually have a free information evening every 6 weeks or so. It just gives some basic information that people can sign up for and come to. And then when people are ready to move ahead, we have an initial meeting to discuss all of the steps and get things started and get the application started. It's a good chance to meet one-on-one and just answer any questions that they have and get the ball rolling. After the initial meeting, the next step is to attend our education seminar, and our education is set up usually over a weekend, and it's a 2-day course. So there's a lot of information that's provided in that course, but hopefully it helps to prepare families to move ahead and to start thinking about some of the decisions they need to make, that kind of thing. We talk about transracial, cross-cultural adoption. We talk about both domestic adoption, private adoption, and intercountry adoption. We also talk about attachment and how to help facilitate attachment for your child to you, especially if the child is older and coming into your home. And so that one's pretty packed full of information. And after you leave that education seminar, then we're able to start the home study process. And that's the approval process to get you up and running and to be active. And the home study is one of those, so it's made up of different parts. There's a series of meetings with a social worker, and there's also some supporting documentation and background checks. So we have criminal record checks for sure, references, medicals as well. And so a lot of people have a concern that they may have a medical condition and are worried that that might prevent them from adopting. And definitely we do not have a list of any conditions that would prevent anyone from adopting. If somebody does have a medical condition, we would just talk to that family and find out what their plan was, and you know, what's your plan for parenting, what's your plan for keeping the child safe, and that's all a part of the home study process. And I know it can be an intimidating thought for a lot of people to go through that assessment, but like I said before, we do understand where people are coming from, right, and that going through that is a very difficult thing. And so we have discussions about just about your life and how everybody's managing everything. So that's kind of like the home study. We go into your background a little bit, to your family life growing up, what your theories are of parenting, and all of that combines to be into a report. And so that report then, you know, at that point you would be recommended by your social worker, and then it would go to the director of the agency to be able to approve you. And so in Manitoba, once you are approved by our agency, then you are active, which means that in our matching process, you would have the potential to be able to be matched with a birth mother. And so your file is open to that. We use a double match system, and so I kind of explained it a little bit. The birth mothers give us information on what they're looking for, and in the home study process for adoptive parents, we talk to you about what you're willing to accept in the background and lifestyle of the birth parents and child. So that would be things like medical issues that are known, also racial background, also how old the child is, and as well as lifestyle factors for the birth mom during the pregnancy, whether there was any substance use during the pregnancy. So it's a very detailed process that we go through with you, and we do ask the birth mother these questions so we get a good idea and can do a good matching process. And so that's part of your process before becoming approved in the home study. We would go through all of that. And then definitely we would review files, whichever files match, and those, even if a family was just approved in the last 10 days or had been waiting for 4 years, all of those families that match would be available for the birth mom to be able to view their letter and pictures. And because of that, it's really difficult to be able to say a general waiting time for families, and I know that's always the first question, because a family could be chosen within a year and a family could wait 4 or 5 years, and it's hard to say what matches are going to come into place because we don't know what birth mom's going to walk through the door, and that also depends on what families are willing to accept. So it does make it difficult to that, and I know that's difficult for a lot of people, the unknown of the waiting, but that's dependent on our matching process, and we look back at matches and we know that it works well because the matches do work. And then once a birth mother has looked at files and has chosen a family, we set up a couple of meetings to meet the family and make decisions on the process, that sort of thing. And just gives the birth mother a chance to meet the family that she read about, make sure that they are the same people and that she feels comfortable. And like I said, with our matching process and reading through the letters that are really give a good idea of who the family is, this is usually just something that is just a confirmation for the birth mom. And so after those meetings, people can get together and get to know each other better depending on when the baby is due. And so once the baby is born, sorry about that. Once the baby is born, the birth mom does have to wait at least 48 hours before she can sign her consent for adoption. Now, that's a Manitoba legislation. I believe a lot of other provinces have a similar time frame before a birth mom can sign her consent. So that's usually the time that she is in the hospital, 2 days in the hospital, and if she is still proceeding with an adoption plan, then we would have a lawyer come and have her sign her consent at the hospital around when she's being discharged. Technically, our adoption counselors can have her sign a consent with us, but we put this extra step in place of having her sign with a lawyer just to make sure that there is not any pressure perceived at all and that she doesn't feel any pressure to sign a consent. So she has her own legal counsel that will advise her and walk her through that. We definitely work with both the birth parents and the adoptive parents during this whole process. We meet with the birth mom in the hospital while she's going through her decision again. We also help prepare the adoptive parents for the new arrival and for the placement and navigate the legal process, and also help do the placement into the care of the adoptive parents. So once the birth mother does sign her consent to the adoption at the 48 hours usually, then the placement can occur with the adoptive family. So we would usually go with the birth mother from the hospital to the adoptive parent's home and spend a bit of time there letting the birth mom introduce the baby to the adoptive parents. And of course, that is the moment that everybody has been waiting for. And the reality is it's such a bittersweet moment. There's lots of losses on both sides and lots of joy on both sides. And so it truly is a bittersweet moment for everyone to be able to share that together. And that's where relationships are built. After the consent is signed, a birth mom does have a period of time where we revoke her consent. And this is the riskiest part of private adoption. And there's no sugarcoating it. It is one of those things that is a fear for a lot of families, because a lot of families have been waiting a long time for this child to come into their care or to have a child join their family, and the thought of the child leaving is just devastating. So we work with families and adoptive parents and birth families throughout the process and provide as much support as we can to birth families too, because a lot of times it's difficult for birth families to know that they can change their mind. And so we just want to support them and help them get through it if that's what it is. If they just need to find a way to get through it, then we will be there for them. In Manitoba, that revocation period is 21 days. So if she changes her mind during that time, she can revoke her consent and the child comes back into her care as long as it's a safe environment. And so, again, we work with the birth mom to be able to visit during that time so that she knows she's going to be able to see her child, and she knows the next time she's going to see the child, because it's hard to know when, you know, if you don't know when you're going to see the child again. So we have visits set up during that time. We also do the openness agreement during that time. So I mentioned that before. That's the contract. That is what everybody agrees to, what kind of contact you'll have in the next years to come. And so that usually gives the birth mother a lot of reassurance moving out of the revocation period, just knowing that she knows that this is going to be upheld. And at that point, she has already had so much trust in the adoptive parents because she's placed her most treasured child with them. And so she trusts them. She just needs to have that kind of reassurance of the ongoing contact. So we work with everybody together to make sure we can find something that's agreeable to everyone. And in Ontario, I believe the revocation period is 21 days. In BC, it's 30 days, and I believe Alberta is 10 days. So those are just the basic ones I know. And so it's important to kind of find that out for any province that you're in. And then once the revocation period has passed, she can no longer sign her consent. The adoption has not been finalized at that point. That's at the point where a court date can be set. And in Manitoba, it's about 3 to 4 months till we can get a court date right now. And so we keep supervising the placements through time, ongoing counseling for everybody involved, and definitely we want to keep track of, you know, how the family's doing and how the baby's doing. And so we have to write a report to the court to recommend the adoption. And so we will just have a series of visits with everybody involved and keep that up to date, and then submit a report. And then once the adoption is finalized, we do not need to have any ongoing supervision. The child is your child as if born to you, and you are the legal parent. And after that, the openness agreement does continue to be valid, but for sure it's not, but an openness agreement also, what we see is around 1 to 4 visits a year. It's not weekly contact, it's not usually monthly contact unless that's something that the adoptive family wants. And so it's usually something that is quite manageable for many families. I know that is one thing that a lot of families have a concern about is the ongoing contact. And the birth parents coming into this, they just want to know that their child's okay. They're not expecting to come in and be a co-parent or to give parenting advice. They just love their child and want to know that their decision is the right one. And having that ongoing contact just gives that confirmation to them, and that is just a reassuring feeling for birth parents. So they don't, you know, we talk to them about the boundaries of contact and everything. They don't just show up at your door. Everything's prearranged, and it can really turn into a beautiful relationship. And just in my final remarks, one thing I always say that I think surprises people is that it's often adoptive parents who want more contact than the birth parent is willing to provide. And that is amazing for those people who are a little bit worried about the unknown of contact in the beginning. But I think after the relationship starts and once adoptive parents realize that the birth parents don't provide any threat to their being parents, and that how much positive it can give to their child, they realize that the more people that love their child, the better. And that is a really beautiful thing to see as well. We do say also that a lot of people may come to adoption as a second choice, but it doesn't need to be second best. And at the end of the day, what families are wanting is a child in their care and to create a family of their own, and that's what adoption does. So thank you all. I look forward to listening to the other presenters, and I will hang on for some questions at the end, I believe.
Thank you, Dawn, for that great presentation. I know that it can be overwhelming for people that want to take on the adoption process, but not knowing where to start or not knowing what the details are. So thank you for detailing what that process might look like for somebody and for speaking on the different options.
You're welcome.
So we're just going to move on to our next guest speaker, Jeremy. So I'll introduce Jeremy, and then we'll have Courtney speak, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box and submit some questions for our guest speakers. So turning over to Jeremy, Jeremy Vosburgh is an adult with CF living in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with his wife, Tara, and their 11-year-old daughter, Darren. Jeremy grew up in the Toronto area, and in 2005, after they were married, Terry and Jeremy moved to Winnipeg for their careers. In 2008, Jeremy joined the Winnipeg Police Service and fulfilled one of his lifelong dreams by becoming a police officer. Jeremy knew from a young age that males with CF were likely infertile. When Jeremy and Tara decided to have children, they met with a fertility doctor and received confirmation that Jeremy was infertile. They began exploring their options on how to grow their family and eventually decided on adoption. So Jeremy, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Eunice. Can you see my screen there?
Yep, you're all good.
It's working? Okay, perfect. So I just want to preface some of the pictures here. I didn't really know what to display, but I thought basically I'd just go with sort of a slideshow of my family and sort of our process. I do want to let you know and make sure Dawn knows that I've talked to both of my daughter's birth parents, and they've consented with their pictures being shown in there, so they're good with this. So the slideshow that, like I said, is just going to be kind of basically our daughter just growing up, our daughter Darren. The first picture here is actually the day that she was placed with us. That's me on the right in the red shirt, and my wife Tara wearing the black shirt right beside me. And then our daughter's birth mother and birth father, and she's 4 days old there. She was placed with us when she was 4 days. I know that Dawn had talked about the 48-hour period, and then Darren's birth mother and birth father asked for an extra day as well. So I'm going to kind of just talk about how we came to the decision to adopt and go from there. So my wife and I knew, well, when we decided we were going to build a life together, that we wanted to be parents. And after we got married in 2005, we began exploring how we were going to do that. So we went and saw a fertility doctor. I got tested, she got tested, and of course we learned that I was infertile. They went through the different options with us, whether it was in vitro or a donor sperm, and we simply decided it wasn't for us. The reality was, to us, the costs were astronomical. We just simply couldn't afford it, and the stats just weren't what we found favorable. So we did some more exploring, and of course learned about adoption and learned about adoption options, which is of course how I was able to link with Dawn. We worked with a separate social worker when we went through a different social worker when we went through the process. But I found it far more in depth than I expected when we went through the process. At the time, I had just gone through a full background check with the Winnipeg Police Service, and I found that it was just as in depth as that, just as many questions, just as much background, just as much reference checks and credit checks and all that kind of stuff as I had done when I was trying to be a police officer. I also found some of the educational stuff, well, to be straightforward, wasn't my favorite. I didn't really like having to learn how to parent when, of course, there's parents all over the place and everyone sort of figures it out. But that was, I was willing to do what we needed to do, or we were willing to do what we needed to do, and we made sure that we were going to get through it. So we sort of set up our criteria for what would potentially be a birth mother, and we were pretty open with that. And I don't really think anything stuck out. What we did want to make sure of was we wanted someone who wanted lots of contact, or what we considered lots of contact. And then when we, of course, were matched up with Darren's birth mother, we seemed to fit her criteria as well. Just to kind of basically describe ourselves, we were young. We were both 26 or so at the time. We were both professionals. We lived in a city. We're not religious. That would be kind of a basic description of us. We met Darren's birth mother and birth father and their families about a month before Darren was born, one time at the office, and we seemed to hit it off with them right away. We had a great chat. We went out for lunch together. We went back to the office, had a further great chat, asked tons of questions back and forth. And then over the next month, we met up at least twice. We went to where they live, and they came to where we live. And it was a great meeting. We started building a great relationship. It was really easy to just sort of chat with them and get along with them and be open with them and show them who we were and to learn about who they were. So when Darren was born, Darren's birth mother was in constant contact with my wife via text message, which I recall is also sort of against the rules. Maybe I shouldn't have shared that. Anyway, they were in regular contact, and then Darren was placed with us at 4 days, and we saw them quite a few times over the next 3 weeks, so that 21-day period. They came to our place, we went to their place. There was tons of pictures. We had contact with their extended family as well, so both of their parents and a couple of times with grandparents, like the birth mother and birth father's grandparents. And yeah, it worked out great. It even came up in conversation whether or not Darren's birth mother would change her mind, and she had assured us that that was never even crossed her mind. She was never going to change her mind, and her birth father said the same thing. We have set up with them I would say probably on the very open end of visitation, especially when Darren was young. We had originally put in writing that we would mail them pictures something like every 2 to 3 months, and there was simply no point. We were seeing them pretty regularly. We were in contact with them via text and video chats, and they were seeing pictures of her all the time. We're of course just seeing her face to face, and they were pretty involved, not in the parenting, but as an extended family. And even when I meet new people, I sort of compare it to going to visit your aunt and uncle and your cousins. And as Darren got older, she knew who they were. She knew the role in their lives. She knew she didn't come from Tara's tummy. She came from her birth mother's tummy. And of course, she's asked the question as well, why? The answer I can't give. It's not my answer to give, but she's been told that she's had this chat a few times. It started when she was around 4 or 5, and it comes up again once in a while. And she just asks, and Darren's birth mother answers the question as best she can, and it seems to work. So we, like I said, have regular contact with them. Even in preparing the slideshow here, I was able to just simply text them and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. You guys good with this? And of course, they're good with it. We spend holidays with them. We see them around Christmas. We see them around birthdays. They've since moved on and created their own families. We've been part of celebrations with those families as well for birthdays and lots of summer holidays and that sort of thing. This has always been a great fit for us. It was basically a dream come true to sort of make this work. I don't really know how else we could have done it, but kind of this setup, the setup we had with her birth parents, the process that we went through, it couldn't have been any more perfect. I apologize if I left some details out, but I'd love to take questions. That's it.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your willingness to share your experience with us and just allowing others to connect who might also be looking at the adoption process. So we will now move on to our next guest speaker and our final, who is Courtney. So Courtney Nichols is from Nashville, Tennessee. She was diagnosed with CF in 1994, and a week later, her sister got her diagnosis. Her parents never thought they would have grandbabies. Courtney is thankful that she can say her sister was healthy enough to have a baby of her own. As for Courtney, she got her double lung transplant young enough to be able to adopt babies. Courtney now has 2 kiddos, Adley Joe, and 6 years old, and Edison just turned 2 years old. So Courtney, I will turn it over to you.
Hey there. Of course, she just introduced me. So I'm from Nashville. I got diagnosed at 14 years old with CF. And my parents knew right away that they wouldn't be able to be grandparents. Mom knew enough about CF to know that it's really hard to have babies when you have this disease, if you live long enough to have the disease. So, so I got sick enough in 2011 that I had to have a double lung transplant. And shortly after that, as soon as I got out of the hospital, my nurse came up to me and told me that I have, that they asked me one question, and if it would be that I wouldn't have babies after my transplant, because they don't know the what the rejection medicines will do to the baby, or being pregnant. They don't have enough resources to know what would happen if I got pregnant, what would happen to me. So I said, yeah, no problem. I've always wanted to adopt. And she was like, well, let us know if you ever want to adopt and we'll approve it, 100%. And I said, okay. So I got my transplant August 2011, January 2012 is when I was way healthy. And I said, I'm ready. And my husband was on board. And so we got approved. We went through all the rigmarole with the background check. We don't have to do credit check in the U.S., or at least in Tennessee, you don't. But we had to do a profile with all of our pictures and a little bit about us. And so the agency requested that everybody go through, like, just let everybody know that that you were wanting to adopt, because they had so many people in their agency that was wanting to adopt. They didn't have enough grandparents. So I had already had a blog with my transplant journey. And so I posted on there, which in turn went into social media, that we were wanting to adopt. And so we just got all kinds of calls, all kinds of people calling us and telling us that I know so-and-so that's pregnant that doesn't need to be, and yada, yada, yada. And so my emotions got way up. And then, of course, I got let down several times. And so November 4th of 2012, we got a phone call from a guy that my husband worked with. And they said, hey, we're pregnant, and you know, I just got through talking to you a few weeks ago, and we want you to adopt this baby, you and your wife. And the crazy thing is, I didn't know a lot of people at my husband's job, but I knew this guy. And then his girlfriend knew me because of my transplant, so she followed me through the whole thing. And so she, you know, they were all about letting us adopt their baby. And she asked us to be very involved in the pregnancy. So as soon as they found out they were pregnant, they called us and said, we're either going to abort this baby or we want to give you this, you know, like let you adopt this baby. And so, of course, we were all about adopting this baby. And so I got to take her to all of her doctor's appointments except for 2, and it was because we were out of town. But I took her to lunch. I took her and got pedicure. I bought her maternity clothes. Everything that I ever dreamed of being able to do, I was able to do with her because, you know, she didn't have the money to buy maternity clothes. I got to buy her groceries. I got to pack a hospital bag. It was just like I was pregnant. I got to have a gender reveal party. We got to have baby showers beforehand. It was really exciting. And most adoptions are not like that, but ours was way different than most, you know, are. But so we got to, she was born in July, and we had to wait 10 days before we could, you know, before they couldn't come back and get the baby. And it was a very, very scary 10 days because when we went to court, they were trying to get her back. And I was scared to death because I was like, I've known for almost 9 months that this baby is going to be ours. There's no way I could, you know, I could handle this if this is not the way it's supposed to go. So then, of course, it went through. That 10 days was the longest 10 days ever. But we made it. And when she turned about 2 years old is when I didn't want one child. I wanted 2. I had always wanted 2 children. And so we put it out there again that we wanted to adopt, you know, adopt again. And a girl saw it, and I still to this day don't understand how she saw my post, but she did. And I think somebody shared it with her or something. And so she reached out to me and said, hey, my stepsister is pregnant and she doesn't need to keep this baby. She has a really bad, you know, a lot of stuff is going on with her and she just doesn't need to keep this baby. And would you be willing to adopt, you know, a boy? And I was like, well, yeah. So I didn't hear from her. Like, it was an off and on type situation. I would talk to the sister like around Thanksgiving, and I was like, hey, yeah, you know, I hope y'all are having a great Thanksgiving. And she was like, thanks. My sister still doesn't know what she wants to do or whatever. So in February, I got a phone call, and it was from the girl, which I didn't know her. I didn't know she had my number. I think she got it from my friend that shared it with her. And she said, hey, this is Jennifer. You know, my sister's the one that's pregnant. And I was like, oh my goodness, yes. And she said, you know, she's decided she wants you to adopt the baby. Can you meet her? So I met her, and I went to their house on a Saturday, and the mom asked if she could have a few days to pray about it. And so I said, absolutely, 100%. So on Monday, she asked until Tuesday, but on Monday, she called me and said, 100%, this is what I'm supposed to do. We want you to have our baby. So, or I want you to have my baby. And so I didn't know how bad the birth father was, but it was not a good situation. And so it scared us to death. And we live like 15 minutes from the birth father. And it was just a very scary situation. And so we upped our security at the house, and we just made sure that, you know, we were being very careful with not posting anything on social media and all that stuff until it was for sure final. And thankfully, now he's going to be 4 tomorrow. and they're both perfect in every way. And we do have a relationship with both of the parents besides his birth father. Our daughter's birth parents used to see her every Christmas and every birthday, but it's gotten harder as she's gotten older, and they just come and go whenever they feel like it. We talk about her. We talk about both of them often, just so she won't ever forget where she came from, and her story is amazing, and all that stuff. But her birth parents are married now, but she had to have a hysterectomy, so she can't have any babies with him. But she has 2 babies before Hadley Joe, and but they do come like to her dance recitals, and they try to be there. But we follow them on social media, and so they get to see her grow up through that. His birth mother is going through a lot right now and moved away to get away from everything. And so she'll text me occasionally and just say, hey, how's my buddy doing? But she's taking it really well. And so she's more apt to just text randomly, just say, hey. And she always says, I want to see y'all, but it never goes through because she's going through so much. But we're done with adoption, where we're done bringing babies into our home, just because I'm getting older and my husband's getting older, and we've always wanted 2 kids, and we've got it. And adoption is absolutely 100% amazing, and it is scary, it is hard, but it is amazing at the end of the day.
Well, likewise, thank you, Courtney, for taking the time to be with us here today and for sharing your experience with all of us. So we're now going to move on to our question period. We will take a few questions. As I've said, if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the chat box to submit your question. I will go ahead and share the questions that I've received so far. So Dawn, Courtney, Jeremy, whichever one of you wants to speak to this. It's just a general question about what type of questions should someone considering adoption ask an adoption agency?
Well, would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So this is Dawn, and I'm the Adoption Options one. So I would say you would probably want to find out their general process. Like I mentioned before, we aren't able to quote a specific wait time, but there might be some agencies who might be able to do that. You would want to know kind of what are the, are there any qualifications that they specifically have for adoptive parents? You probably want to ask about what kind of fees are involved, because every agency would have different fees for services they provide. And you would want to know some of those things about, does the birth mom have a revocation period for her consent? And just really what kind of support does the agency provide to you as an adoptive parent? I would say those are some basic ones that would be good.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm just going to ask once again from our audience, if there's any questions, please use our chat box to submit questions. And while I wait for that to come in, I guess I'll turn it over. Maybe Dawn, Courtney, and Jeremy, if you guys could each just maybe share some final words or some final considerations for the adoption process.
I can go first. I think what I'd want to say, I guess just from my own experience, is adoption is fantastic. The way kind of Nicole summed it up at the end there. Sorry, I'm also at home with everybody. Yeah, I would just say that that it's fantastic. It's not perfect, but it couldn't have worked more perfectly for us. There was times where it was stressful, times kind of going through at the beginning where it was a little frustrating, but I would say that if you want to be a mom or a dad, then this is an option that you should at least be considering.
Thanks, Jeremy. Courtney, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that every story is different, just like with CF, just like with double lung transplant, just like everything. Every story is different. My daughter's story is different than my son's story. My best friend's story, everybody's story is different. But there's sometimes that I wish I could be more involved, or they could be more involved with their birth parents, but their stories are both different. So I'm glad that they are both the way it is. But I highly recommend adoption. And if anybody ever has any questions, I'm always available to answer any of those.
Thank you. And Dawn, for any final words.
Okay, yeah, sure. I guess what I just want to say is that often the most scary part of anything is the unknown. And so it's important to ask questions and find an agency to help support you and can answer those questions to the best of their ability. And they can walk through it with you, because often what happens is the reality of the situation is not as scary as the unknown when you're thinking about it. So if you have any reservations, ask the questions, do your research, find out what works best for you, because there are definitely different ways of forming families, and not every way is right for every person. But it's always good to get the information so that you're making an informed decision. And a lot of times we don't know how situations are going to end up, and sometimes we don't know why families wait a longer time and some families don't. But in the end, out of every placement that we see, we can look back and say, oh, that's why, because this is what was meant to be. And so just kind of remember that when you're going through the process. There are some times when it's uncomfortable, sometimes when it's scary, but in the end, adoption is just another way to become parents, and that is the end goal for a lot of people. And we have seen so many beautiful families form, and that is why we're here, and that's what we want to do. And for these kids to have permanent homes, and for families to have the child they always dreamed of.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dawn, Jeremy, and Courtney, for making the time to speak to us about the adoption process as an option for family planning for people with cystic fibrosis. And thank you to everyone who tuned in, who's joining us today. So our fertility and family planning webinar series is ongoing. Next month, we will be focusing on the emotional support during family planning. So we invite you all to keep an eye on our Facebook page and on our website for more information. And as always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to advocacy@cysticfibrosis.ca. So that's it for today. This webinar was recorded and will be made available for future viewing. Thank you all.